Worldwide, cardiovascular disease affects the lives of hundreds of millions. Dedicated CardioNerds everywhere are working hard to fight this global epidemic. These are their stories.
Welcome back, CardioNerds. Thanks for joining us for another episode in our series on digital health and cardiology. This is a collaborative effort with Corey Health and supported through an ACC chapter grant. We are very excited for today's discussion on integrating digital health into practice as it features some world experts in digital health, Dr. Alexis Beatty and Dr. Seth Martin. Now, before we get started, I'd like to reintroduce our series co-chairs, Dr. Karan Desai and Dr. Nino Isakadze.
Thank you, Dan, for the introduction. And I just want to take a brief moment to introduce my co-chair, Dr. Nino Isakadze. I think I'm fortunate to be on this series because I think out of everyone here, I'm pretty much the only one that's not an expert in digital health. But my co-chair here is certainly a rising star, if not a star, in digital health. And so, Nino, welcome back to the series, and it's great to do another episode with you.
Thank you so much, Karan and Dan. I also want to highlight that Karan Desai is actually a superstar clinician educator at Johns Hopkins, and we're really lucky to learn from you every day.
Well, now I want to take a moment to introduce one of our experts. First, we welcome Dr. Alexis Beatty. Dr. Beatty is a general cardiologist and associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at UCSF. She completed internal medicine residency at Massachusetts General Hospital and completed her cardiology fellowship and MAS degree, again at UCSF. Dr. Beatty worked at Apple between 2018 and 2019 and participated in the development of their heart features and research app. Dr. Beatty is one of the leaders in the field of cardiac rehabilitation and digital health research, so it is an immense honor to welcome you to the CardioNerds podcast, Dr. Beatty.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the podcast. This is my first time on the CardioNerds podcast, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. And next, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Seth Martin. It is very special for me to introduce Dr. Martin, as he has been my extraordinary mentor since the beginning of my cardiology fellowship. Dr. Martin completed his internal medicine residency at the Duke University. He completed cardiology fellowship at the Johns Hopkins Hospital and obtained master's in health science degree from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Martin co-directs the Digital Health Innovation Lab. In addition, Dr. Martin serves as a director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Mobile Technologies to Achieve Equity in Cardiovascular Health, which is part of the American Heart Association strategically focused research network on health technology and innovation. Dr. Martin is a core faculty member at the Chickarani Center for the Prevention of Cardiovascular Disease, where he directs the Advanced Lipid Disorders Program. He also serves as a chair of the AHA's National Statistics Committee and is a president of the Maryland AHA Board. Welcome, Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Nino. It's really a very special honor for me to be joining you all. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I have had the great pleasure, Nino, of getting to work with you at Hopkins Cardiology and in the AHA Health Tech and Assivern Network. And it's just wonderful to have the chance to have this conversation with other colleagues on this important topic of digital health, which I really think is a big part of the future of cardiovascular medicine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for being here. And this is a super treat for me. I got to learn directly from you for 8 years and beyond so many great aspects of cardiology and prevention, but also in terms of life, networking, and just continued growth in the field. So Dr. Beatty and Dr. Martin, again, thank you for joining us. And the CardioNerds are really excited to have you here. Maybe you can start with describing your journeys towards the career in digital health and cardiovascular medicine for our listeners. So how about we start with you, Dr. Beatty? What's your journey like?
Sure. So we were joking earlier, how far back should I go? First computer was an Apple IIe, but really I think my digital health journey started about 10 years ago. And I was working with my mentor, Mary Hooley, and we had started looking into the underuse of cardiac rehabilitation. And we were trying to think of ways that we could, get more people to participate in cardiac rehabilitation. There was a digital health grant that was just a small funding grant that was available through UCSF. And so we wrote a grant to get this funding and ended up getting the grant. And the grant was basically to build a mobile application for cardiac rehabilitation. That really set off my career in digital health, because from there I started thinking about how do you design digital interventions to help people improve cardiovascular health? And from there, started working on building that mobile application, ended up working on building a mobile application through the VA. And then in 2018, got recruited to go work at Apple on their health features. Ultimately, I decided that I belonged back in academic medicine. So I came back to UCSF, but I continue to work in digital health and advancing the science of digital health. Seth, what was your first computer?
That's a great question, Dr. Beatty. So I also had the fortune of, growing up in a family where I was exposed to the early Apple Macintosh computers. I would have to kind of look back at our basement storage area or something at our house to sort of look at exactly which Macintosh was the first one we had, but it was definitely early like yours. And I remember just as a kid really being fascinated by computers and technology. And it's really, I think, a bit of a kind of going back to that in this career in digital health where, ended up going into a career in medicine and cardiology, but digital health has been a way to kind of tie in computer technology side of things. I had this experience as a fellow getting into big data where we're dealing with a data set of over 1 million patients and needing, higher levels of computing power and creative approaches to the way we visualize those data, and had an experience creating a calculation for LDL cholesterol to more accurately assess it. And that was really a very transformative experience for me because it was a kind of a quest of challenging the status quo and being a problem solver to better serve our patients. And because of our work was able to be validated and adopted at a massive scale through integration into laboratory technology. And we also did build an app that helped clinicians and patients whose labs were not yet adopting the LDL calculation. It really led me to see that academia was not only kind of an academy to generate knowledge, but also was an incubator for technologies that could then get outside the walls of our academic institution and have a real tangible impact on our patients. So it was kind of in the setting of that experience that I had. And as I was planning sort of my next phase of research, was really interested in the idea that we have so much we know around lifestyle habits that our patients can follow and evidence-based medicine that we know are so important for improving the outcomes of our patients, but get implemented in a very haphazard way. And I was interested in this idea of technology being part of the solution for how we more reliably implement care, how we build new delivery models for care that could better serve our patients, looking at technology as a way to both educate our patients, but then also connect them with tools to manage their health, to take that more active role in their healthcare. So initially I had a strong interest in physical activity. So I think, Dr. Beatty, as I was getting into this world of digital health, I did start to come across some of your work on building your cardiac rehab program. And then, of course, we later got to know each other during your time at Apple. So it's been really a nice kind of journey of building new collaborative partnerships with others interested in building a better future for our patients. So I had an experience around physical activity with the M-Active trial, working with Mike Blaha was my key collaborator on that. And we built a system using a wearable and automated text message coaching to promote physical activity in our cardiac patients. And we had some early success with that in a small pilot randomized trial. And then that went on to be validated, the text message algorithm we built in other clinical populations through NIH-funded research. So that was sort of the next phase of my digital health journey. And then early in my faculty career, I had gone to the NIH M Health Training Institute. And then I came back to Hopkins where I created a digital health interest group. And it was through that experience and kind of a newsletter that we had some exposure in that I met Dr. Francoise Marvel, who I think you've heard, if you've followed the CardioNerds and Corey collaboration here, you've heard from Dr. Marvel on prior part of this series. And so she was an incredible internal medicine resident who was working in our HexSite technology accelerator program at Hopkins. And so she subsequently has gone on to do fellowship here and as a faculty member. And it's just been an amazing journey building the Corey Health program with her, which has been designed to empower patients to follow guideline-directed cardiovascular care. Our initial vision here was starting in the acute care setting as patients transition to the post-acute setting where we're connecting patients with a smartphone-based app paired with wearables and blood pressure monitors there in the hospital at that moment that really matters and to set them up for success as they leave the hospital. So I think we'll probably circle back to more of that kind of building the technology and the journey together with Dr. Marvel and the rest of the team. But that was really kind of the series of events that led me to get very interested in digital health.
Thanks, Dr. Beatty and Dr. Martin, for giving your journey. And I think a lot of what we hear from people that are highly successful on this podcast is some is good fortune. A lot is a lot of good work. And much of the success is also finding great collaborators. And it seems like you all have found that along your pathway, as we all have here at CardioNerds. So taking it back to our topic for today, through the series, we have talked about the general landscape of digital health and cardiovascular medicine. We've talked about equity in digital health, and we've talked about best practices for digital health innovators, including with Dr. Marvel, like you talked about, Dr. Martin. Today we'd really like to focus on aspects of integrating digital health into practice. And maybe to highlight this, we can start with an example. Before we started recording, I was just mentioning I just finished a week in the CCU, and I had several patients come in with STEMI. For example, there was this man, a 66-year-old man, who had come in with an anterior STEMI, who we were able to promptly revascularize, start him on appropriate medical therapy, and then started thinking about discharge. And when it came time for discharge, we recommended cardiac rehabilitation. But he noted he couldn't easily get to the physical location. He said he had heard about some mobile apps for other health conditions and asked if there was one for cardiac rehab and how he would go about using one. So Dr. Martin and Dr. Beatty, before we address our patient, you both have conducted studies in digital cardiac rehabilitation interventions. Maybe we could start with your own experiences developing digital health solutions like cardiac rehab and specifically barriers you've faced in implementing them in a clinical setting. Dr. Martin, we could start with you, and then Dr. Beatty, hear from you after that.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to directly discussing the patient because the situation you described is very much what was in our mind when we first started building the Corey Health app. We're really focused on that time of discharge after we've done all that great work on the inpatient setting to open somebody's artery and to get them started on guideline-directed therapies. Then that transition is critical. And so that was very much our focus as we started off on things. I would say that our experience in developing the technology has very much been focused on putting the patient at the center of things. And this started back when Dr. Marvel was a resident. She was doing interviews with patients at the bedside when they were there or hospitalized with a heart attack. And over time, our methods have matured to include collaborations with the Center for Health Equity, where and Dr. Nino Isakadze has played a really big role in developing our partnership with the Center for Health Equity and integrating formal human-centered design methodology into the way we build our technology. And that methodology is now something that we're using as well in the Corey collaboration that I have the pleasure of working with Dr. Beatty on. It's really about starting with the patient and working backwards to the technology, that we really don't just try to take the technology and kind of plug it into solutions, but really at a deep level, understand the patient journey and the problems to be solved, prioritize the features that really need to be built, and then partner with great engineers to build those features. Of course, a critical part of our experience developing a digital health solution has been having that collaboration with engineering. And so we had the fortune, Dr. Marvel and I, meeting Matthias Lee, who has been our lead engineer ever since 2016 on building Corey. And so having his kind of strong, steady leadership and focus on the craftsmanship around the software has been a really critical ingredient. So it's very much a journey of finding, I think, the right partners who see the vision and the impact you can have and bringing that to their work every day to build the solution. So when we rolled out the first version of Corey in the MyCore trial, that led us to get early evidence around Corey, but also to get additional feedback around how we can optimize the technology onboarding and clinical workflow. So I think once a team has what we call MVP, a minimum viable product, it is important to then bring that into the clinical setting to test it, get feedback, see if it's working as intended, and plan next steps. And so I'll just finish my response to this question by noting that one of the patients who participated in our MyCore trial, who we ended up writing a case report jointly with her, she had really connected with the technology in the CCU where you were just recently attending, Curran. She had a heart attack and really felt like she had gotten great care, but she wasn't understanding things as well as she would like to and wasn't feeling as connected to her care. And so she enrolled in our trial. She was someone who didn't come in with a lot of technology knowledge or familiarity. And she was given a loaner, a phone and smartwatch and blood pressure monitor as part of the study. And she then described binge watching educational videos and starting to ask more questions of her team the next day on rounds. She started doing laps around the nursing station and tracking her physical activity. And as she transitioned home from the hospital, she really overhauled her cardiovascular risk factor profile and did incredibly well. And to her, it was not just about the technology, but the way the technology was integrated into a program that she felt really cared for her. But interestingly, and this leads us into kind of further discussions that we're going to have, she could not afford the insurance copayment for traditional cardiac rehab. And she basically ended up doing her own form of cardiac rehab using the initial version of the Corey technology. But her lack of access to traditional center-based cardiac rehab was part of what inspired us to then build that as part of the future roadmap of Corey.
It seemed like not only did the patient feel like it was something that she was able to integrate into her own lifestyle and be able to manage her cardiovascular risk, it sounds very empowering too for the patient. And that can't be understated for how powerful these digital health solutions may be. Dr. Beatty, do you have additional thoughts or your own experience to share with implementing digital health solutions and barriers you have faced?
Yeah, I just want to echo a lot of the things that Dr. Martin was saying when he was talking about his experience. And I can't emphasize enough how important approaching digital health from human-centered design is. Human-centered design is extremely important in how you approach digital health and digital health interventions. Thinking about the people who will be using the technology and how they will be using the technology and how that technology helps them solve a problem. And so this whole process of, conducting human-centered design studies and building things using the human-centered design process is just extraordinarily important. And Dr. Martin and Dr. Marvel and the whole team at Hopkins has done a fantastic job in building Corey using all of those human-centered design. And it really is just about meeting people where they are, both for our example patient here and for Dr. Martin's patient that he was talking about. That phrase will get repeated again and again and again, meeting people where they are. And then the other thing I do want to bring up, though, is that at least when I think about these digital health solutions, I really do think about the technology as a tool that's part of the broader system of care. And so oftentimes, the technology doesn't exist completely and totally on its own. It exists within the system of care, so there's the patient and the clinician and the hospital and the health system, and sometimes even other players like payers. And then the technology is just one part of this whole system of care that we're delivering for people. And there are some instances where the technology does a lot of the heavy lifting, but I think more often than not, the technology is just a tool in this whole system of providing care for people. And so it is kind of important to remember how it kind of integrates within that whole system. The other thing that I want to bring up is that when I think about the whole idea of barriers or, how do you build things and try to make sure hitting all of the bases, a number of years ago, was introduced to this theoretical framework called the Unified Theory of Acceptance and Use of Technology, and people abbreviate it UTAUT. And there's a version of this theory that's for consumer devices, and it has, I think there's 7 or 8 things in it. I'll list them all out and you can count them later. But one of them is performance expectancy. Does it do what you think it's going to do? One of them's effort expectancy. How easy or hard is it to use it? One is facilitating conditions, and that can be a grab bag of a lot of things. It can be the training that you supply to people on how to use the technology, but it can also include things like connectivity, even having a device. The next one is social influence, and that includes the people around you, and oftentimes when we're asking our patients to use these pieces of technology, the social influence doesn't come from necessarily their friends and family. Oftentimes it is their providers and the clinicians that they work with. And so sometimes, they want to, prove to you that they're supposed to be doing. So they like entering their exercise so that you can see that they did it. And then the other factors that are involved in this are, one of my favorites is hedonic motivation. Is it fun? Another one is habit. And the final one is price value. So is it a good value for the money? And so a lot of times when I'm thinking about the barriers, I kind of go through my little mental checklist through all of those pieces of the UTOT theory when I'm thinking about the barriers to implementing a particular piece of technology. And sometimes the technology can address all of them, but sometimes you need to build in other system pieces so that you can enable people to use the technology, whether that's a smartphone loader program or training on how to use an app. So you can think of ways you can build those pieces in to address any barriers that may be there.
Thank you, Dr. Beatty and Dr. Martin, for sharing your insights about developing digital health interventions and implementing them. Building on our discussion in terms of barriers, how do you approach privacy concerns with digital data, as digital health solution use includes transmission of actionable patient data for clinical as well as self-monitoring? And how do you think we can keep the patient data safe?
And in our research that we're doing right now as part of our telehealth cardiac rehab study called the McNair study, we're finding that the patients have, I think, a wide array of concern about privacy. Some patients really care about it a lot. They definitely read all of the fine print and are very concerned about the safety and the privacy of their digital data. And other patients seem to just, be fine with signing up for whatever it is that comes their way. And so there really is the whole spectrum of concern amongst our patients in terms of their concerns about privacy. And I really do think that privacy is critically important. This is one of the things that when I worked at Apple, we talked about a lot. And some companies, I think, have a lot more attention to privacy than others. And the kind of principles that I try to work by are transparency and control. I think, number one, we need to be transparent about, the privacy policies and about how data is being transmitted and kept and who has access to that data if the data is being, sold or used in any specific ways. So number one is transparency and just letting people know, the truth about what's happening with their data. And then I think the second part that's important is control. So transparency and control. And then control is letting people have control over what data they're sharing. And so that may be, giving people the option to not share some of the data they don't feel comfortable sharing. And so using these two principles of transparency and control, and then really kind of giving that to the patients, I think is one of the key pieces to honoring people's preferences about privacy.
Okay. And here's a follow-up question for you, Dr. Beatty, on the above what we had just talked about. So building on data privacy and that whole discussion, Dr. Beatty, you have unique experience of working with industry, as we mentioned, such as Apple, as well as in academia. So it would be super helpful for our audience to hear from you about specifics of industry partnerships for digital health intervention, development, and evaluation. What is each side looking at, and how can we build a sustainable but also transparent relationship with industry when it relates to healthcare?
Yeah, this is a great and tough question. And I think that there are often different things that industry might be looking for in different partnerships. But if you think about it from, what does industry not have? Industry often might have some doctors or some other healthcare professionals who work with them, but they're not usually full-time doctors. They're not people who are spending a lot of time sort of on the ground, either working with patients or, working in clinical settings. And so they don't have that on the ground, up-to-date knowledge of what's happening. So that's one thing that they don't really have. And then the other thing that they don't really have is patients. They don't really have access to patients in clinical settings. And so a lot of times from industry, that's what is most attractive to them about working with people in academia or out in the community for digital health intervention development. And, for the Corey example with Dr. Martin and his team, one of the things that I think Apple was looking for there is that they had all these tools and research kit and care kit, and they wanted people to have good examples of how they would use them. And they're interested in, helping to support people to use the tools that they have and provide good examples of how people would use those tools. And so I think if you're, looking to do a collaboration or a partnership with industry, I think you can think about it from that perspective. What is it that I have that the industry does not have? Because for the most part, they're probably not going to be looking for you to be doing their engineering or building their algorithms. They're probably going to be more interested in what you can bring in terms of the application of their tools, out in the real world. And I do think it is really important when you are working with industry to make sure that you go into it with everybody being, clear on what the roles and goals are so that you can have a productive partnership.
Thank you, Dr. Beatty, for sharing your insights on industry and academia collaboration. We know that digital health intervention use, including cardiac rehabilitation intervention use that you described, Dr. Martin, earlier, is generating a lot of actionable clinical data. Can you share how do you approach interoperability of data generated with digital health interventions with, for example, EHR, and how do you overcome the challenge of data silos? Furthermore, how do you approach creating efficient data workflow, which could limit the clinician burden? And Dr. Beatty, you can build on later.
Thank you, Nino. Yeah, this is a great question. I think a tough question and certainly something I would love to hear Dr. Beatty's thoughts on too. When it comes to interoperability of data into the EHR, we've over the years kind of had a number of conversations with we're at Hopkins, we're on Epic. So with the Epic IT group here around different levels of integration and what makes the most sense. And I would say from what we've learned, as well as what we've learned from other partners, other university partners in our HA Health Tech and Innovation Network, doing deeper levels of EHR integration can be quite time-consuming, resource-intensive, and the timeline for that can be on the order of years, not weeks or months. And so for a team, I think it does depend on what stage of your development and scaling you're at what you may choose in terms of integration and interoperability. We early on, considered also the fact that it's easier to read data than to write data back into the EHR. And this actually ties in a bit with sort of the questions around industry academia partnership. Apple had released a tool to read data from the EHR that we were an early adopter of. The writing data back to the EHR, there's quite a bit more hoops to jump through and resources to do that. If you look at often what happens in clinical practice in terms of data back into the EHR, it's really a simple PDF upload or just a summary report upload into the EHR. If you look at the way that outside lab results or imaging results or Holter monitor reports get into the EHR, that's often the way that they're going in there. And so as we started off with Corey, that's what our initial approach has been, to focus on data back into the EHR as a PDF summary, along with just having simple ordering ability within the EHR. We do also have a clinical dashboard where you're logging into another system, the idea there being that it's more user-friendly for clinicians to interact with. So I guess this starts to get into the second question around efficient data workflow and how we can limit clinician burden. I think part of this is we can provide a better user experience in a clinical dashboard that really provides quick access to the real-time data that are needed. And it's not that every clinician needs to go in there. So depending on the program, for example, with the cardiac rehab program, we have our exercise physiologist who uses that dashboard at the time that they're doing patient coaching calls so that they have direct access to how much the patient's been exercising and overall step counts and vital sign data and med adherence and so forth, so that they can use those data to better tailor their conversation with the patient. It's not that we expect the cardiologist to be continuously reviewing the data in the dashboard. That would obviously be overly burdensome. But when the patient then follows up with the cardiologist in clinic, having that summary available can enhance decision-making. If you have a summary report of the patient's medication adherence and how much physical activity they've been doing and more data on their blood pressure, that certainly can improve the clinic visit and the ability to adjust evidence-based therapies. So that's sort of been our approach, but I'm definitely interested to hear more of Dr. Beatty's thoughts on this topic as well.
You bring up a lot of great points, Dr. Martin. I think one of the first things that I'll mention is the importance of using data standards. And so, if people are out there building digital health interventions or interested in doing that, I think it's increasingly important to follow sort of health data standards, principles, whether it's FHIR or HL7 or making sure you're using, SNOMED or LINK codes or whatever it is. Make sure that you're using the appropriate data standards. And the data standards are constantly evolving too. For instance, one of the things that came up when we were first building the cardiac rehab app with the VA was we were trying to figure out what data standard applied for minutes of exercise. And it seems like there would be a standardized data element for that. But it turns out there actually wasn't. And so this is actually a data element that's going to be built into future iterations of data standards to help capture some of these important measurements in a standardized way. And then one of the other things you brought up, I thought was really important, Dr. Martin, talking about we can read the data from the EHR, but this whole idea of writing the data to the EHR is a lot more challenging. One of the projects that we've been working on at UCSF, and this is in collaboration with one of the PharmDs who's in our cardiology clinic and helps with all medical management for things like hypertension and up titration of GDMT for heart failure. So she had worked out with our Epic crew how to get patient-generated blood pressure measurements written into our EHR. And so there's two ways that this can be done. One is through a flow sheet that the patient can enter in through MyChart. But the second way, we do have a method to pull the data in from the patient's phone. And so the patient can, hook their blood pressure cuff up, have the blood pressure cuff send its data into like the Apple Health app. And then the MyChart app on the patient's phone can pull the data from the Apple Health app. And then that can then write to the EHR. However, it takes the patient 26 steps to set this up. And 26 steps is a lot. And so there are ways that you can do it to get that data to write to the EHR, but they're just horribly burdensome right now for the patients. And it's a big barrier that unless you have somebody who can sit with the patient and set this whole system up, it's been too much for a lot of our patients to figure out how to do it. But once you do have that data, it can be very powerful for helping to manage people's blood pressure, helping to manage their condition. But then it does bring up this other question of this burden of clinical data that's coming in to all these clinicians. And, with hypertension, we can kind of set, guidelines like, I don't want to know about every single blood pressure. I just want to know, after the patient's entered 10 or every 7 days or whatever it may be. So you can set some parameters around things like that. But I really do feel like this challenge of having a ton of data coming in to the EHR from all these, digital health things that we have now, it's an opportunity. I think it's a data science opportunity for people to study, how best do we distill all this data into the things that are important and into the things that actually impact patient outcomes.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Beatty. And yeah, these definitely are great opportunities to amass large quantities of data and learn so much and allow us to take care of patients better. But let's switch gears a little bit because this is another major issue that comes up with digital health tools. So for example, let's talk a little bit about payment. And as an example, virtual cardiac rehab. We know it's a broad topic, but Dr. Martin, could you touch upon how different payment models may affect uptake of digital health tools?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I could kick off the conversation here around kind of fee for service versus value-based models. But I think we definitely want Dr. Beatty's thoughts here because she's been a key leader in thinking through the way that cardiac rehab specifically can be reimbursed or sustained or, basically what the financial model is around that. And it depends, or at least it's been a kind of rapidly changing landscape with the pandemic and with the different delivery models, from synchronous to asynchronous forms of delivery of cardiac rehab. And there's still a lot that lies ahead in the road there for cardiac rehab reimbursement. But just to take a step back, of course, the traditional model of care is a fee for service where there's a focus on, revenue generation, whereas the alternative model that's gaining more momentum is a value-based model. So in a fee for service model, the healthcare professionals, the clinic, hospital, health system are reimbursed based on the quantity of services. Whereas in a value-based care model, there's more of a focus on quality, efficiency of care and on patient outcomes. And so it's really kind of these two different worlds of a focus on volume versus quality and outcomes. And so value-based care is particularly well aligned, I believe, with digital health interventions, which ultimately, as you heard, we're focused on building these through human-centered design efforts to better serve the interests of patients as well as clinicians, health systems, payers, stakeholders kind of across the board. And so in our Corey health work, we did conduct, based on our initial MyCore trial, economic analysis in collaboration with Bill Padula from the Hopkins School of Public Health. He's subsequently gone out west. But that analysis showed in our heart attack population that our digital health intervention was associated with both better patient outcomes in terms of reduced readmissions, as well as substantially lower costs related to those prevented readmissions. And so from a health economic standpoint, this is a dominant strategy, meaning that you have both an improvement in outcomes and costs. Usually we're talking about something being cost effective, where we pay more and we get better outcomes and we think that it's worth the extra that was paid for it. But in the case of digital health, there may be this opportunity to both improve the costs of care as well as patient outcomes. And so if we can focus on dominant digital health interventions and scale them through value-based models, I think that could lead to a really bright future. And in that way, digital health could really be part of building a new delivery care model. As Dr. Beatty said, it's very important to think about digital health in the way that it is one tool in the way we deliver care, but it seems to be a particularly attractive tool when you start thinking about payment or cost along with patient outcomes. But that's kind of a broader framework. I think it may be interesting to hear Dr. Beatty talk a little specifically about cardiac rehab payments, because she's been a national leader in this.
Dr. Martin, I don't have a whole lot to add to your position there that digital health tools can be a big part of value-based care, because I completely agree with you. To add to the piece about cardiac rehab specifically, I'm going to take this opportunity with the CardioNerds listenership here to try to advocate for some legislation that's currently circling its way through the U.S. Congress. So there's U.S. House Bill number HR 1406, which is called the Sustainable Cardiopulmonary Rehabilitation Services in the Home Act, that's currently circling around Congress. And what all of you could do here is to write a letter to your congressperson to let them know that you support this. And basically, this bill would allow people to continue to provide virtual cardiac rehab, similar to what we did with the public health emergency allowances during the pandemic. So those public health allowances have gone away now that the pandemic has been declared, quote unquote, over. But, we still have a big need to be able to deliver this type of care virtually. And unless it's reimbursed by Medicare, it's really hard to convince hospitals and health systems to adopt a virtual cardiac rehab program. So it's really important that we get this legislation through Congress. And unfortunately, there's no way to do it just through Medicare regulations. It has to be legislated through Congress. So in order to write the letter, there's a really easy way to do this. And I can give you all a link if you want to include it in like show notes or something, but it's www.aacvpr.org/T and then lowercase a, lowercase k, lowercase e, dash, uppercase a, lowercase c, lowercase t, lowercase I, lowercase o, lowercase n. Take action. And that lets you write a letter to your congressperson. So if anyone wants to jump in and support virtual cardiac rehab, I'd appreciate your support.
That was impressive that you knew that right off the top of your head, that address. I sometimes struggle with my home address, remembering it the right way. Dr. Beatty and Dr. Martin, this has been a really enlightening discussion about everything from barriers to payment models to working with industry. And we've really had a chance to do a deep dive into the nitty-gritty of implementing digital health solutions here. Now, we started this conversation about a patient, and both of you have emphasized that digital health solutions start with a patient. So if we take it back to the patient from the beginning of this conversation, this is someone that was looking to be able to do cardiac rehab potentially at home because they didn't have the ability to get to the physical location. So myself, as the bedside clinician, how would you tell me to advise this patient on how to best gain access and take advantage of digital health tools like cardiac rehabilitation? Dr. Martin, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm so glad to end by bringing it back to the patient because ultimately that's what this is all about. So as the bedside clinician, I think let's just use cardiac rehab as the example. I think, first of all, it's very important in the idea that digital health may be integrated into a program like cardiac rehab. And ultimately, to me, the impact of the bedside clinician can be emphasizing the importance of that program, having enough knowledge to explain to the patient what it is that they're being referred to and motivating them to do that. That could make or break whether the patient actually enrolls in the program. And then, of course, giving the referral. And although those sound very simple, in current times, it's very common for patients to leave the hospital not knowing what cardiac rehab really is and to leave without a referral. So to me, those are really the critical ingredients. I know we're talking about digital health, but I don't know that the bedside clinician needs to dive into too much aspects of the digital part of it. I mean, it's ultimately part of the toolkit in the way that we deliver care. And if digital health has been integrated into the cardiac rehab at the hospital or health system where you're working, that'll naturally be part of the options that the patient's presented with. And in the case of Dr. Beatty and I, our patients are being given the options for clinical trials, but I'm kind of approaching this question outside of that clinical trial context in terms of routine clinical care. And so to me, it's about educating the patient, the bedside, that a program exists. And then the digital part could be naturally part of that. And then if you have the pleasure then of not only getting to care for that patient in the hospital, but then you're following up with them in the outpatient clinic, I think you'll find a patient who likely is more engaged and knowledgeable about their care. They're doing a better job than usual overhauling their cardiovascular risk factors like the woman I described earlier in our conversation. And so you'll meet that engaged patient in clinic and they'll have better data that you can use together to advance their guideline-directed care. So I think as clinicians, if we more and more, we're going to see these patients in the outpatient setting after discharge that are empowered by digital health, and it's helping us do a better job and better partnering with our patients to improve their outcomes. And then my hope is over time, more and more clinicians will become champions because they see that this is really improving their practice of medicine, the joy in the practice of medicine, and improving the outcomes of our patients.
Thanks, Dr. Martin. Dr. Beatty, would you have anything to add?
When I think about this patient, I think in a lot of places, there aren't a lot of opportunities for using, mobile apps for things like cardiac rehabilitation. But if I were to, think about how we do things at UCSF in the context of clinical trials that we do have available, or if I think about, STAD place in the future, maybe 10 years from now when HR 1406 passes and we have reimbursement for virtual cardiac rehabilitation and there's opportunities for virtual cardiac rehabilitation that are available everywhere. I would say that this patient sounds like a great candidate for doing a cardiac rehab program that's still engaged, with the health system and is facilitated by this tool of a mobile application. And even if you don't go fully virtual in your cardiac rehab, there can be a lot of patients who can also benefit from hybrid approaches. So maybe if you can't come into the physical location 3 times a week, you can come into the physical location a few times at the beginning to kind of get things going, get things started, and then be able to complete the program using the mobile apps. And I think that's what we've seen with a lot of the research too, that it's not necessarily that the mobile app, helps people improve their exercise capacity more than traditional in-person cardiac rehab. What it actually helps them to do is to participate in and complete the program. And so we can use these digital tools to help meet people where they are and help them actually be able to engage in a more full experience. And hopefully down the line, help the patients to improve their outcomes as well.
I think that's a perfect way to end for a great message that you both reiterated throughout this discussion here, to meet the patients where they are. And hopefully we've inspired some of our listeners to take the charge to continue to move the field forward in digital cardiovascular health. I just want to thank the both of you, Dr. Beatty, Dr. Martin, for joining us here today, Nino and I and Dan. And I know all our listeners are really going to benefit from this conversation. So thanks for joining the CardioNerds podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. It's been great.
Thanks for tuning in to another CardioNerds episode. The audio editing for this episode was performed by me, Shivani Reddy. I'm an intern in the CardioNerds Academy Haus Eindhoven and a 4th-year medical student at Western Michigan University School of Medicine. I invite you to check out the episode page for show notes and references.
If you found this episode informative, please consider subscribing to CardioNerds on your favorite podcast platform and leaving us a review. It helps us spread the word and further our goal to democratize cardiovascular education. Finally, this podcast is not meant to be used for medical advice. The views expressed on our show and site do not reflect the opinions or policies of our employers. All CardioNerds content is planned, produced, and reviewed solely by CardioNerds. Stay tuned for more engaging conversations and explorations in our upcoming episodes. And now, it's time to make like an S2 and split.